The moment the cameras cut to commercial, the air inside the studio felt like it had shattered. A heartbeat earlier, under the bright daylight flooding through the high glass panels of the studio set, the audience of The View had been leaning forward with curiosity. But now the silence was thick and suffocating. Producers were whispering urgently into headsets. A stage assistant froze beside a camera dolly. And at the center of it all stood Prince Harry, his shoulders rigid, his jaw clenched, as the realization settled in that something meant to be a conversation had turned into something much heavier. Across the curved table, Sunny Hostin sat with an expression that mixed disbelief and determination. The tension between them had escalated faster than anyone in the room had expected. Just minutes earlier the atmosphere had been casual, almost warm. But a single question, sharp, probing, relentless, had struck a nerve that Harry had spent years trying to bury beneath public appearances and practiced smiles. And suddenly the studio lights seemed too bright. If you're watching this story on Fates Intertwined, pause for a second right here. If you believe that even the most painful moments can lead to healing, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe. Stories like this exist to remind us that even the strongest people carry invisible scars. Because beneath the polished stage of morning television, the moment unfolding was not just about controversy. It was about wounds. Long before that day in the studio, Harry had been living a life that felt split into two realities. One part belonged to the world, ceremonies, speeches, flashing cameras, carefully written headlines. The other part existed quietly inside him, shaped by memories that still lived with painful clarity. The memory of walking behind a coffin while millions watched. The feeling of growing up with grief before he even understood what grief meant. By the time he arrived at the studio that morning, the sun was already high above Manhattan, pouring through the city streets and reflecting off glass skyscrapers like sheets of light. Harry had stepped out of a black SUV wearing a simple navy suit, trying to steady himself with slow breaths. Interviews were nothing new. He had faced journalists for decades. But something about this one felt different. Perhaps it was the way the city itself seemed restless that morning, the distant horns, the rush of pedestrians, the wind tugging at banners outside the studio entrance. Or perhaps it was the quiet exhaustion he had been carrying for years, an exhaustion that came from defending his life choices over and over again. Inside the studio, the set of The View glowed with warm daylight tones. Soft pastel walls, a semicircle desk, rows of audience seating. It was designed to feel inviting, even comforting. The producers had greeted him politely. Makeup artists adjusted a light powder across his cheek. A stage manager counted down the seconds before the broadcast began. Everything was professional. Everything was controlled. Until it wasn't. At first the conversation had flowed smoothly. Questions about his charitable work. Reflections on mental health advocacy. Thoughts about raising children in a complicated world. Harry spoke carefully, choosing words with the caution of someone who understood how easily a single sentence could become tomorrow's headline. But then the conversation shifted. Sunny leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful yet probing. Her question wasn't cruel, but it carried the weight of years of public debate. The kind of question that forces someone to confront not just public criticism, but the private doubts they carry inside themselves. And suddenly the room felt smaller. Harry's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the desk. For a moment he tried to answer calmly. He spoke about family, about choices, about the difference between protecting oneself and abandoning something important. But the more he spoke, the more he felt the invisible pressure of 1,000 narratives pressing against him. The audience sensed it too. A subtle tension began to ripple across the studio. Heads tilted. Brows furrowed. A producer glanced nervously toward the control room window. Sonny continued pressing gently but firmly, the way experienced journalists do when they sense a story beneath the surface. And then Harry's composure cracked. Not dramatically. Not explosively. But in a way that felt raw and unmistakably human. His voice grew sharper. His eyes, usually soft with careful diplomacy, flashed with something deeper, years of frustration, grief, and the quiet loneliness that comes from living inside a life the world constantly judges. For a few seconds the conversation spiraled beyond the tidy boundaries of daytime television. No one shouted. But the emotional gravity in the room was undeniable. Producers signaled frantically. The director called for a break. And the screen faded into commercial graphics. When the cameras went dark, the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Harry pushed his chair back slowly. He wasn't angry in the way headlines might later describe. Instead, he looked tired in a way that comes from carrying a story too heavy for one person to explain again and again. A producer approached cautiously, explaining that it might be best if the segment ended early. The words were polite. Professional. But the meaning was clear. Harry nodded once. And just like that, the interview was over. Outside the studio, the afternoon sun had climbed higher, casting long reflections across the sidewalks of Manhattan. Harry stepped outside into the bright daylight, the noise of the city rushing back into his ears like the world had suddenly remembered him again. For a moment he simply stood there. Not as a prince. Not as a headline. Just as a man trying to breathe. Across the street, people passed by without noticing him. A street vendor arranged fruit beneath a striped umbrella. A mother pushed a stroller past a row of taxis. The ordinary rhythm of life continued, indifferent to the emotional storm that had just unfolded behind studio walls. And something about that ordinary scene stirred a quiet realization inside him. For years he had been trying to outrun the past. Trying to explain himself to strangers. Trying to prove that stepping away from one life was necessary to build another. But maybe healing didn't come from explanations. Maybe it came from acceptance. The acceptance that some people would never understand. And that was okay. As he walked down the sidewalk, the wind brushed lightly against his jacket. Somewhere above, sunlight reflected off the windows of skyscrapers like thousands of tiny mirrors. The city felt alive, relentless, hopeful. And for the first time that day, Harry felt something shift inside his chest. Not relief. Not triumph. But something quieter. Perspective. If this story has stirred something in you so far, take a moment to support it by liking the video and sharing it. Stories about human struggle only matter when people care enough to listen. Because the truth was, the moment inside the studio wasn't just about an argument. It was about vulnerability. The kind that even public figures rarely get the chance to show. Before the final part of this story, leave a comment and tell us, do you believe public figures deserve the same understanding and compassion as everyone else? That evening, as the sun began drifting lower over Manhattan's skyline, Harry sat quietly in the back of a car heading toward the airport. The city glowed golden in the fading daylight. Buildings softened into silhouettes. The river reflected the sky like molten glass. He looked out the window, watching the street slip past. Somewhere in the distance a group of children laughed as they chased each other through a park. Their voices carried faintly through the open window. And suddenly the chaos of the day felt smaller. Because beyond the cameras, beyond the debates and headlines, life continued with quiet, ordinary beauty. Harry leaned his head back and closed his eyes for a moment. Not defeated. Not victorious. Just human. And sometimes, being human, flawed, emotional, imperfect, was the most honest story anyone could tell. The car disappeared into the evening traffic as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky painted with fading light. A reminder that even after the most uncomfortable moments, the world keeps moving forward. And so do we.